My name is Chris O'Leary, and I'm a survivor of the Catholic sex abuse crisis. You can find me online, chriso'leary.com/sins. On Apple Podcasts, my podcast is called Sacrificed. And I wanted to comment on the University of Scranton panel that was held tonight, which may have been the first hopeful thing that I've seen in all the panels that I've watched because of the honesty. And I'd like to acknowledge the courage of the people at the University of Scranton and thank them for their courage and their honesty and their willingness to put on that event. And I say this with all sincerity. I hope you have jobs tomorrow. I hope the repercussions of hosting tonight's event aren't too serious. I mean that with all sincerity, based on what's happened in other cities and dioceses and archdioceses. I know that there are organized survivors or organized supporters. I think they're kind of lay supporters of Catholics in different cities. And some of those organizations have faced repercussions, and I've been told from reliable sources that Catholics who work for Catholic institutions who are associated with those survivor-friendly or survivor-supportive, survivor advocacy organizations have been fired. The bishops do not like people supporting survivors and helping them to speak up, which is why I found the University of Scranton event tonight. It's November 10th, 2021. I found that particularly refreshing. I am nervous for you. But I will say that if there are consequences, I count you among the righteous. If there are consequences for what happened, you should understand that I, as a survivor, am very appreciative for what happened. Because I thought the event tonight was absolutely devastating. No punches were pulled. No dams were given. No dams were left to give at the end of the evening. As I said, I am a survivor myself. I tell my story elsewhere on my podcast and on my website. To a degree, my story is the answer to the question of what happened after Spotlight. If you know the story of Spotlight, the movie, and as the professor who kicked off the event said, if you haven't seen Spotlight, you should. But my story is the answer to what happened next. Basically, my Spotlight led to the resumption of my story, helped me to realize that something had happened to me when I was a kid. I was sexually abused, assaulted, the whole thing, at the Church of the Immaculata in the late 70s by a priest named Father Leroy Valentine. Abuse that was witnessed, at least in part, by then Father and now Cardinal Timothy Dolan, the Archbishop of New York. And that's one of the reasons I found the event tonight so compelling, was the mention and the focus, the mention of and the focus on the bishops, because that really is the problem. The problem is that the bishops have yet to be held accountable. Why would they change if they're not being forced to change? And the fact is they're not being forced to change. They're being enabled, and they're acting in the manner of people who are and who have been enabled. The bishops are being enabled, and they got a good gig going. Why would they change anything? They're living large. They're surrounded by sycophants. If they're not abusing children, the fact that they did abuse children in the past is being covered up. They're being protected by their brother bishops, by their buddy bishops. And I've been told to be clear, Dolan didn't do anything to me. Dolan just turned a blind eye to my abuse, and worse, which is basically the story of Spotlight. Spotlight dropped in January 2002. By early March 2002, an article ran in the New York Times. I went to the Archdiocese of St. Louis for help understanding what the article was saying about my favorite priest and one of my favorite people. Then Bishop Dolan called me back. So Bishop Dolan, who at the time was Father Dolan, was asked to investigate crimes with which he was complicit, which, gives you a sense of how things work. That was under Archbishop Regali. Archbishop Regali Cardinal Regali asked Bishop Dolan to clean up his own mess, which is how things work in the Catholic Church. Bishops help other bishops. They watch out for each other. They protect each other, which is one of the themes of the event at the University of Scranton, and one of the reasons why that event was so devastating and so on. Was the emphasis on the bishops. And Chris from the Angry Catholic was really devastating on that. God, she just let it fly, which was awesome. The event did give me some hope. I can only wait. I can only imagine what the repercussions of that are going to be for a Catholic university to give free rein to survivors to tell their stories, and a very passionate advocate for survivors in the form of the Angry Catholic folks. For a Catholic university to do that is unprecedented. I've talked before, I think in kind of my last video, talking about how disappointing I've found panels of survivors, because generally it's the right survivors, and these are survivors who ultimately, first and foremost, want to make sure that the church survives. That's their primary concern and consideration. My primary consideration is that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. I've just found the event tonight very, very compelling. From what I understand, there's going to be a rebroadcast of that. I would suggest, anyone who's interested in survivors and survivor matters should go to the University of Scranton website. Hopefully they will still replay this event. I may try to save it myself if they put it up and then someone orders them to pull it down. I'm going to try to save it onto my own website. I think that's a serious possibility. The event was that devastating. The truth was told, and in particular, the bishops were named, and the accountability and responsibility and lingering, continuing responsibility of the bishops was identified and discussed at length. And that really is the problem. Why aren't things getting better? Because the bishops who, like Timothy Cardinal Dolan, who saw at least some of my and our abuse at the Church of the Immaculata in St. Louis, Missouri, they weren't punished for that. They were not punished for turning a blind eye to my and our abuse. Rather, they were rewarded for that. Dolan's loyalty, instead of going to the police, Dolan went to Monsignor Flavin at Immaculata and kept his mouth shut, which established Dolan as a reliable, dependable member of the church, of that thing of theirs, La Cosa Nostra, which really isn't fair. The mob has standards. The mob would not do what I apologize. I formally apologize to the mob and to criminals. You guys have standards. The Catholic Church doesn't have standards. It's really not fair to the mob and to criminals to lump them in with the Catholic Church. So I apologize to the criminals and to the mob. the Catholic Church is a completely different entity operating under Satan. And I should make this clear, a lot of the people there expressed concerns about their faith. I'm no longer a Catholic. I still have a toe in the church in terms of so my patron saint, Sister Mary McKillop. I don't know if you drop the sister once they become a saint, but I still find value and encouragement and courage in the example of the saints. I think that's something the Catholic Church does do right in terms of, yes, the focus should be on Jesus Christ, but if that's not possible for someone, by giving people examples of courage in the saints, I think is an idea that makes sense. Examples of courage and virtue in the saints, in the communion of saints, is an idea that I think makes sense and can help lead people to God and to Christ. I am still a Christian. In some ways, it's actually strengthened my faith. I feel one with Jesus Christ in terms of, as I've said in other places, as I came to realize when I was standing vigil outside the Cathedral Basilica of the Archdiocese of St. Louis at the Mass of Reparation, where I was ignored by every priest in attendance. I realized that if Jesus Christ can do what he did, entering Jerusalem on Palm Sunday to a certain and known fate, then I can do this, what I'm doing. I'm really just kind of blown away by the event, the fact that it happened. I've never seen that happen before. And that's as I said in one of my prior videos, maybe the prior video, I've been really unimpressed by panel discussions with Catholic survivors, because too often discussions of the sex abuse crisis do not include survivors. It's a bunch of talking heads talking about it. And I've found that too often those talking heads are Catholic converts. And in my experience, Catholic converts are often the worst on the sex abuse crisis, which is one of the reasons, again, why Chris from The Angry Catholic, I found her stuff so ballsy and devastating. She's not like the other converts that I know of. She's a convert who is facing the sex abuse crisis dead on. That's very unusual. I do hope the people at the University of Scranton are safe. I hope they're protected. I don't know whether you and they appreciate the risk that they took. I guess it's a Jesuit institution, so theoretically maybe they're protected from a bishop, or there's at least a layer of insulation. The Jesuits aren't great. My abuse started in my Catholic grade school and then continued on to my Catholic high school, St. Louis University High School, where I was sexually exploited and abused in the locker room. Basically, the locker room was unsupervised, and certain Jesuits just prowled the locker room looking at boys. And I don't know whether guys were touched. I don't think I was touched, but being a survivor from grade school, seeing a Jesuit priest sit on the bench outside the shower stalls at St. Louis University High School and just tear me apart with his eyes while I was taking a shower was enough to just destroy me for high school. I didn't recover till college. To some of the questions they asked tonight, what was the kind of big moment of revelation? Like I said, the start of my revelation was the movie Spotlight. The Spotlight reports, it's really kind of weird because it was 20 years ago that, they're writing the Spotlight reports now. 20 years ago is when the Spotlight team was starting to write things up, when they were starting to make discoveries, when a lot of the drama, when the call with Richard Sipe, I think, happened this time of year, 20 years ago, a couple months after September 11th, they got back on the story, the Spotlight people. I think about that a lot. That was 20 years ago. they came up with a list of 100 or so priests, or a large number of priests, a much larger number of priests than they expected. All that stuff was happening 20 years ago. So then right after the first of the year, 2002, the Boston Globe team, Spotlight team, wrote up the first of basically a 2-day report. In my case, what happened is that led the New York Times to start looking for comparable stories. And for whatever reason, the New York Times ended up in my backyard, St. Louis, Missouri, Belleville, Illinois, wrote a piece. Lori Goodstein, Jody Wilker, and Two Paths, No Easy Solution on Abusive Priests, kind of contrasting the handling of the Archdiocese of St. Louis and the Diocese of Belleville across the river in St. Louis. That report, or that article in the New York Times, named Father Leroy Valentine my favorite priest and one of my favorite people from my childhood. And just kind of, it didn't, I was gonna say it devastated me, but it didn't devastate me. It did stun me, but I didn't know what it meant. So what happened was I ended up calling the Archdiocese of St. Louis, trying to understand what it meant, hoping they could tell me what it meant or help me understand what it meant. And Bishop Dolan, who was the vicar for priests, auxiliary Bishop Dolan at the time, Timothy Dolan, called me back. Hey, Chris, Tim Dolan, Bishop Dolan, been a long time. So I asked him, I told him 4 memories involving Valentine, some of which as a parent I kind of understand are hinky, but at the time I didn't really it's Father Valentine, come on. And Dolan immediately, without any investigation, that on that same call, and to be clear about this, is all happening on one call. I told Dolan what happened. He didn't do any investigating. He immediately came back at me with, I've known Leroy Valentine forever. We were in the seminary. We lived and worked together at Immaculata. I know he didn't do any of the things that he's accused of. I know that Leroy Valentine would never do anything to hurt a child, which is good enough for me. What I didn't know at the time, and so I actually just went on with my life, didn't think about it. I had more events. I had basically a panic attack in 2003, another panic attack in 2005, lost my job in 2007. So that one conversation with Dolan was enough to just ruin me. Although I didn't realize I was ruined, but I didn't know why I was ruined or what was ruining me. What I didn't know at the time was that someone else called in at the same time with a comment about Father Valentine. And then a couple of weeks later, another guy called in. I have a memo, a document that documents that second person who called in. And I know personally, and have talked to extensively at length, the third person who called in. So what ended up happening is that Dolan ended up forcing Valentine to resign at the end of March 2002, and never called me back, never said, hey, Chris, I know I told you this stuff doesn't mean anything, but maybe it did. Did have me talk to a psychologist. Dolan had me talk to a psychologist who he sold as an independent, but she was actually the assistance coordinator. She again told me nothing happened, that my memories didn't mean anything, that I was just misinterpreting what Father Valentine was doing or trying to do or what he intended. And it was groping. And there's a lot of overlap with my story, between my story and the stories of the other guys. A lot of it was groping. When Chris talked about Father grabbing guys' groins, that was how Valentine, so people talk about grooming. Well, before grooming is the phase of testing. And the way Valentine would test you is he would grab you down there. He would grab your groin and see if you reacted. If you froze, then he would go on with the process and groom you. If you reacted strongly negatively, you failed the test, then he wouldn't do anything. In Valentine, near as I can tell, tested, groped, grabbed the groins of every guy at Immaculata he could get his hands on, at least. that was just how Valentine operated. He was just, his first step in the process was testing guys by groping us, by grabbing our groins and seeing whether we reacted or not. So when Chris from the Angry Catholic told that story, that that bothered me. To some of the other points that were raised, this is other aspects of my story I haven't really talked about. I didn't have a drug problem. I actually went the other way, where I became such a control freak that I think what happened is he used alcohol or drugs to get to me, and I somehow subconsciously understood that. So I barely drank in St. Louis. I'm not a complete teetotaler, but I didn't really kind of loosen up until I went to college in Texas. And that was one of the things that kind of resonated with me. Was I would go on vacation, especially vacation with people from St. Louis, and this was like, after I got married, I'm divorced now, but after I got married, people would say, God, Chris, you're a completely different person, here in Cancun or St. John or in Texas than you are in St. Louis. And, you hear that enough times and then you start to realize, okay, maybe that's the thing. Yeah. But, in terms of the consequences, I've lost my wife, I've lost my family, my kids don't talk to me. I have my first grandchild on the way. I haven't talked to my son, whose wife is pregnant. I haven't talked to him in 4 months or so. Maybe when the baby's born, they'll talk to me and introduce me to the baby. I don't know. I've never seen their house. Because I got vocal and started making my case and pleading for me, the Archdiocese of St. Louis launched a smear campaign against me, all part of what I call the abuse of the abused. You can see that, listen to that in my podcast, which led my parish to shun me. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, I wanted to mention, and thank God for the survivors and for them telling their story, but I can completely vouch for their stories. The same thing happened to me in terms of the complete and total indifference. I did meet with my bishop right out of the bat, and I've got the recording of this that I'll publish on my podcast at some point. Right out of the gate, he told me, even though we can't do anything, even though we're not going to help you, he still offered to be my spiritual advisor, or to give me spiritual guidance. And I'm thinking, why the hell would I accept spiritual guidance from someone who could know that this happened to me and refuse to help me? No, thanks. And which goes to the credibility problem of the Catholic Church. Again, I'm a Christian. I'm barely a Catholic. I am a Catholic in the sense that I still revere the saints, and I look to the saints for guidance, and I do believe in Mary. I had a very interesting experience outside the window of this room. I prayed for a sign and something happened. It's an interesting story. But the indifference that people talk about, I experienced that very much myself. The lawyers, well, and that was, I ended up meeting with the Archdiocese of St. Louis with the review team in May 2011. A meeting that wasn't supposed to have lawyers. The Archdiocese of St. Louis brought not one, but 2 lawyers to that meeting. Never told me there were going to be lawyers, never offered me, never informed me of that so I could get my own lawyer. They wanted to maintain that advantage for themselves. These are absolutely terrible, terrible people, minions of Satan. Everything that you heard at the University of Scranton meeting is exactly what I experienced and more. These are the absolute worst, most horrible, terrible people. And the problem really comes down to the hierarchy. The bishops, the monsignors. I think one of the reasons that priests get the honorific title Monsignor is because of their willingness to do something to help the church. And many of those deeds involve covering up sexual abuse. Taking one for the team. helping the team out, helping the company out. These are really terrible people who would do absolutely anything. They have no regard for all the stories they talk about. They have no ability to apply any of the stories, Matthew 7:5, the story of the Good Samaritan. None of those stories have any bearing. None of those stories influence how they treat people. Part of the problem is the lay Catholics that they're surrounded by and enabled by, who tell them how awesome they are even when they're not. And that is one of the problems. And that's one of the things that I'll say is, lay Catholics, you have a responsibility for this. You can be part of the solution, or you can continue to be part of the problem. And by being part of the problem, just by keeping your mouth shut, that's part of the problem. The bishops are looking to the response of the laity. If the laity isn't talking up about this and complaining about this, the bishops assume that the laity is fine with this. By staying silent, you, the laity, are complicit in what the Catholic Church is doing. You may not be knowingly complicit, but the fact is that your silence is consent. It's being interpreted as consent. And now that you've seen this and you know that, you have a responsibility to start speaking up and out, letting people know that you don't like this, letting your priest know that you don't like this, letting your bishop know that you don't like this. If you don't, you are as guilty, as complicit as the people in the 70s and 80s who saw things. And in some ways, you're more complicit than the people in the 70s and the 80s, because there wasn't the press coverage that there is now. Now there's the press coverage. You can't avoid it. You could deny it, but you can't avoid it. I know it's very scary and it's intimidating and it's horrifying and you don't want to believe it, but the fact is that it's true. It happened. It is happening. If you don't believe me, listen to my podcast, Sacrifice, which is on Apple, Google, Spotify, all the major platforms. chrisoleary.com/sins. That's where all my writings are. Just Google Sacrificed Podcast, Chris O'Leary, and you'll find my stuff. I know this is scary, but the fact is that if you don't want to be part of the problem, you need to explicitly work to be part of the solution, which is to let people know, let your fellow Catholics know, let your priest know, let your bishop know that this is not acceptable, that you are not good with this. I understand why people want to leave. That's fine. I'd prefer that you stayed and fight, that you stay inside and be the squeaky wheel. That's the only way that things are going to change. And I know it's scary and it's terrifying. I feel it all the time. I need to go back to my bishop and talk about Vos Estis Lux Mundi, the Pope's Bill of Rights for survivors. I need to assert my rights under Vos Estis, and I've been putting that off and putting it off because it's scary as hell. But you know what? If you believe this stuff, if you are a Christian, then you know that if Jesus Christ can do what he did on Palm Sunday, entering Jerusalem to a certain and known fate, then you and I and we can do this.